Look who crowded in. Still showing up to places you don't belong. You know what's sad? You actually thought you were something once. Now look at you. Standing here like a ghost at somebody else's party. That's for wasting 6 years of my life pretending you mattered.
You just poured wine on a billionaire.
The wine was still dripping off my chin when I realized nobody in that ballroom knew who I really was anymore. 6 years ago, Victoria walked out of our marriage with everything except my name. Tonight, she was about to find out that was the one thing she should have taken too. I stood near the tall marble columns of the grand ballroom, half hidden in the shadow of a floral display, watching 300 of the city's wealthiest black families mingle under gold chandeliers. This was the Architectural Vanguard Gala, the one night a year when developers, investors, and old money all pretended to like each other. I wasn't on the guest list. I didn't need to be. My assistant had already handled that detail weeks ago, quietly, the way I handled everything now. I almost didn't come. Part of me wanted to skip the whole thing and let the plan unfold without ever standing in the same room as her again. But there was a piece of me, the part that still remembered eating instant noodles in a cold apartment after the divorce lawyers finished carving me up, that needed to see her face when it happened. Not out of love, out of proof. Proof that surviving her had built something she could never touch. Then I heard her laugh. I would know that laugh anywhere. Sharp, practiced, the kind she used when she wanted a room to look at her. I turned, and there she was, Victoria, wrapped in a shimmering gold gown that probably cost more than the apartment I used to sleep in after she left me with nothing. Her arm was looped through Richard's, the real estate billionaire everyone in the room was quietly terrified of. He had that easy, confident smile men get when they think the world owes them a favor and keeps paying up. For a second, I thought she hadn't seen me. Then her eyes locked on mine, and her whole face changed. She let go of Richard's arm and started walking toward me, heels clicking against the marble like a countdown. People noticed. Conversations slowed. I stayed still, because moving would have looked like fear, and I had spent 6 years making sure I never looked afraid of anything again. "Look who crawled in," she said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. "Still showing up to places you don't belong." I didn't answer. Silence used to be a weakness of mine. Now, it was a weapon. That seemed to make her angrier. She glanced at Richard, then back at me, like she needed an audience to finish what she started. "You know what's sad?" she said, her voice climbing. "You actually thought you were something once. Now look at you, standing here like a ghost at somebody else's party." A few people laughed nervously. Someone lifted their phone. I felt the old version of myself want to explain, to defend, to remind her that I built the company she took credit for in our divorce settlement, the one her lawyers argued was hers because her name ended up on the paperwork after I signed everything away just to be free of her. But explaining had never worked with Victoria. She only understood one language, and it wasn't words. She reached for the glass of red wine in her hand, and for a moment I actually thought she wouldn't do it. Even after 6 years, some tired part of me still expected her to hesitate before hurting me in public. She didn't. The wine hit my face and chest in one cold, sudden wave, soaking into the collar of my shirt and running down my jaw. The ballroom went silent, except for the low murmur of shock rippling outward. Someone gasped. A photographer near the stage lifted his camera on instinct before lowering it, unsure if this was a scene worth capturing or a mess he shouldn't touch. Victoria smiled like she had just won something. "That's for wasting 6 years of my life pretending you mattered," she said. Richard didn't look embarrassed. If anything, he looked amused, arms crossed, watching me like I was a stain on his evening rather than a man standing in front of him. I could have said something. I could have let the anger out, the 6 years of it boiling right there under the chandeliers. Instead, I reached into my jacket, pulled out a folded handkerchief, and wiped my face slowly, deliberately, like I had all the time in the world. "Thank you for the reminder," I said quietly. I needed one. Her smile faltered, just slightly, confused by how calm I was. She expected tears or rage. She got neither. I turned and walked away, past the stunned crowd, past the photographers now definitely raising their cameras, toward the private elevator at the far end of the hall, the one guarded by two men in suits who nodded and stepped aside the moment they saw my card. Victoria's laugh echoed behind me, but it sounded thinner now, less certain. She had no idea that elevator didn't lead to an exit. It led straight up to the penthouse suite of the very building she was standing in, a building I had purchased 11 months earlier through a company she had never heard of. She thought she just humiliated a nobody. She had actually just declared war on the man who owned the roof over her head. As the elevator doors closed and the gold light of the ballroom disappeared behind steel, I finally allowed myself a small, quiet smile. 6 years of silence were about to end tonight, and Victoria was going to learn exactly what I had built in the dark, while she assumed I had nothing left to give. The penthouse was quiet in a way the ballroom below could never be. No music, no whispers, no eyes waiting for me to break. Just the soft click of the elevator doors sealing shut, and the city lights stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a map of everything I had spent 6 years building without anyone watching. My assistant Daniel was already waiting with a garment bag draped over his arm. He didn't ask what happened downstairs. He didn't need to. The stain on my shirt told him enough. "They're saying it's already on 3 different social accounts," he said, unzipping the bag to reveal a fresh black tuxedo. "Someone caught the whole thing." "Let them post it," I said, pulling off my ruined jacket. "It's better this way." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing else. Daniel had worked for me long enough to know that when I stayed calm instead of furious, it meant I was already 3 steps ahead of whatever chaos was unfolding beneath us. I walked into the private bathroom off the master suite and looked at myself in the mirror for the first time since the wine hit my face. There was a faint red mark near my collarbone where the glass had grazed me. I barely felt it. What I felt instead was the weight of 6 years pressing against my chest, memories I hadn't let myself sit with in a long time. When Victoria and I divorced, her legal team didn't just take half of what I owned, they took all of it. The house, the cars, the shared accounts, even the small architecture firm I had spent a decade building from nothing. Her lawyers argued, successfully, that my name on the paperwork didn't matter because she had handled the public-facing operations, while I stayed behind the scenes designing. In the eyes of the court, that made the company hers. In the eyes of everyone who knew us, it made me the fool who let his wife walk away with his life's work. I remember sitting in a rented studio apartment the week after the settlement, staring at a laptop with $11 left in my checking account, wondering how 6 years of marriage had ended with me owning nothing but a mattress on the floor and a folder of old blueprints nobody wanted. That night, instead of falling apart, I made a decision that changed everything. If Victoria and her lawyers were going to take my name off of everything visible, then I would build something so far outside her line of sight that she would never see it coming. I started small, a consulting contract here, a freelance design deal there, all under a shell company nobody could trace back to me. Within a year, I had saved enough to make one quiet investment in an undervalued commercial property nobody else wanted. Within 3 years, that one property became 12. By year 5, I wasn't just investing anymore. I was controlling entire blocks of the city through a structure so layered that even seasoned investors couldn't map where the money actually started. I never used my real name. Every deal ran through Halcyon Sovereign Holdings, a fund most people assumed belonged to some reclusive foreign investor nobody had ever met. That mystery worked in my favor every single time. People negotiate differently with a name they can't picture. They get careless. They underestimate. Daniel handed me the tuxedo jacket, and I slid my arms through it, feeling the fabric settle against my shoulders like armor. "You could have skipped tonight," he said quietly. "Nobody would have blamed you." I needed to see her think she still had power over me, I said, fixing my cufflinks in the mirror. It's the last time she'll ever believe that. The truth was, Victoria's stunt downstairs wasn't just petty cruelty. It was fear disguised as confidence. I had watched her body language the moment she noticed me in that ballroom. She hadn't expected me there. My presence alone had cracked something in her composure, and instead of asking why I was in a room clearly meant for people worth far more than she assumed I was, she chose to attack first. That told me everything I needed to know. Some part of her still remembered exactly how much I used to matter, and it terrified her. I checked my watch. 20 minutes had passed since I walked out of the ballroom. Downstairs, the auction for the waterfront development rights would be starting soon, the single most valuable piece of real estate the city had released in over a decade. Richard had spent months publicly bragging about acquiring it, treating the bidding process like a formality rather than a competition. He had no idea the auction house hosting tonight's bidding had quietly changed ownership that very morning, sold through Halcyon Sovereign Holdings in a deal so private that even the auctioneer didn't know who had signed the final papers. Daniel checked his phone and looked up at me. "They're calling the room back together. Bidding starts in 5 minutes. I straightened my jacket one last time and looked at my reflection. The same face Victoria had humiliated less than half an hour ago, except now it carried something she had never seen on me before. Certainty. "Good," I said, walking toward the elevator. "Let's go remind her what she actually threw wine on tonight." The doors opened, and as I stepped back into the elevator, I realized this wasn't just about winning an auction anymore. This was the first domino in a much longer plan, one I had been quietly building since the day her lawyers handed me divorce papers and called it a victory. She thought that night ended her marriage to a nobody. In a few minutes, she was going to learn exactly what that nobody had become. The ballroom looked different walking back into it the second time. The same chandeliers, the same marble floor, but now every conversation seemed to carry an edge, like the room itself was still processing what it had witnessed 20 minutes earlier. Heads turned as I stepped out from the private hallway near the stage, and I caught more than a few people whispering behind champagne glasses, unsure whether I was the man who got humiliated or someone they should be paying closer attention to. I found a spot near the back, close enough to see the stage, far enough to stay out of Victoria's direct line of sight for now. She was near the front with Richard, both of them glowing with the kind of confidence people wear right before they lose something they never thought they could lose. The auctioneer, a sharp older man in a navy suit, tapped the microphone and the room quieted. Behind him, a massive screen lit up with renderings of the waterfront development, the crown jewel of the night. 12 acres of prime coastline, zoned for a mixed-use project that would reshape the entire district for the next 50 years. Every major developer in the city had been chasing this land for over 2 years, but the previous owner had held out, waiting for the right moment and the right price. Tonight was that moment. "We'll open the bidding for the waterfront parcel at 10 million, the auctioneer announced, and the room stirred immediately. Numbers rose fast. 15 million, 20, a pause, then 30 from a hedge fund manager near the front row, followed almost instantly by 35 from a woman I recognized as one of the city's biggest hotel investors. The energy in the room climbed with every number, but everyone in that ballroom knew this was really a two-person race, and both of those people were standing near the stage with matching expressions of quiet certainty. Richard let the bidding climb to 40 before he even lifted his paddle, a calculated move meant to look effortless. When he finally raised it, his voice carried across the room like he was announcing a coronation. 50 million, he said, smiling toward the cameras positioned near the stage. A ripple of applause followed, the kind reserved for men who were used to being the biggest number in any room. The auctioneer scanned the crowd. 50 million, going once. Victoria beamed beside him, gripping his arm, already celebrating a win that hadn't technically happened yet. I watched her lean toward him and whisper something, her lips curling into the same smile she used to give me back when we were young and she still believed I was going to be someone worth staying married to. Going twice. This was the part of the plan I had rehearsed in my head more times than I could count. Not out of doubt, but because I wanted every second of it to feel exactly right. I stepped forward. The movement caught attention immediately, dozens of heads turning as I walked toward the stage with the same measured pace I had used walking away from Victoria earlier that night. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, eyes narrowing slightly as he tried to place me. "I believe the room isn't finished yet," I said, loud enough for the microphones near the stage to pick it up clearly. Richard's smile faltered for the first time all evening. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion in the span of a single breath.
"And you are?" the auctioneer asked, though something in his posture told me he already suspected the answer.
I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small black card, the kind that didn't carry a name, only a seal representing Halcyon Sovereign Holdings. I handed it to him and watched his face change the moment he read it. "This gentleman," the auctioneer said slowly, clearing his throat, "acquired ownership of this auction house early this morning. He has full standing to bid." Whispers erupted across the ballroom, sharp and immediate, the kind of noise that spreads faster than any official announcement ever could. I turned toward the crowd, toward Richard's stunned expression, toward Victoria's face draining of the color it had held so proudly just moments earlier. 150 million, I said. Cash, wired within 24 hours if the room agrees to close tonight. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the applause started, hesitant at first, growing louder as people realized exactly what they had just witnessed. $100 million jump in a single bid wasn't just aggressive, it was a statement. Richard opened his mouth like he wanted to counter, but nothing came out. His firm had already stretched itself thin, acquiring adjacent parcels in anticipation of winning this one, a fact I had learned through months of quiet research long before tonight. There was no version of this room where he could match that number, and everyone with financial literacy in that ballroom knew it instantly. Victoria stared at me, and for the first time since the divorce, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not the practiced confidence she wore like armor. Fear, sharp and sudden, the kind that comes when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his voice steadier now, professional composure returning. "Going twice." I kept my eyes locked on Victoria as the final word was spoken. "Sold." The room erupted into applause again, phones raised everywhere, photographers pushing toward the stage for a closer look at the man who had just spent 9 figures in cash without blinking. Reporters who had been covering the gala for lifestyle segments were suddenly scrambling to figure out who I actually was. Victoria hadn't moved. She stood frozen beside Richard, whose hand had slipped away from her waist entirely now, putting distance between them without even realizing he was doing it. I stepped down from the stage slowly, letting the moment settle over the room the way I had let the wine settle on my skin earlier that night. As I passed close enough for her to hear me, I leaned in just slightly. "You should have asked who I was before you poured that glass," I said quietly. Her lips parted like she wanted to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in 6 years, Victoria had absolutely nothing to say to me. I didn't go home that night. There wasn't a version of me that could have slept after watching Victoria's face collapse in real time. So instead, I sat in the back of my car outside the auction house, going through the details of the wire transfer with my legal team while the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Daniel called just after midnight. "Your security team picked something up," he said. "Victoria and Richard left the gala together, but not the way they arrived." I already knew what that meant. The easy confidence they'd walked in with, arms linked, matching smiles for the cameras, had cracked the moment I stepped onto that stage. What happened after they left was something I hadn't personally arranged, but I had suspected it was coming from the second Richard's paddle dropped to his side without a counterbid. My head of security, a quiet former federal agent named Marcus Webb, had a standing arrangement with me that covered anyone directly connected to active deals I was involved in. Richard's firm had been on that list for months, ever since his company started circling the same waterfront parcel I had been quietly positioning myself to take. It wasn't personal surveillance, it was due diligence, the kind any serious investor runs before committing 9 figures to a deal. Victoria simply happened to be standing next to him when the cameras and microphones in his own home picked up everything that followed. By the time I got the full report the next morning, I understood exactly how fast things had unraveled inside that mansion. According to the transcript, the moment they walked through the door, Richard didn't say a single word to Victoria. He went straight to his study and started making calls, his voice climbing with every passing minute as he worked through what the audit team later confirmed. His firm had leveraged nearly 60% of its liquid assets in anticipation of winning the waterfront rights, banking on that land as collateral for 3 other projects already underway. Losing the bid didn't just cost him an opportunity, it put his entire portfolio at risk of default within the next quarter. Victoria followed him into the study, and the recording caught her trying to comfort him, telling him it was just one deal, that they would find another opportunity, that his empire was bigger than one piece of land. Richard's response was immediate and cold. "One deal," he repeated, his voice sharp enough that even through the recording I could hear the fury underneath it. "You think this is about one deal? Do you have any idea who that man is?" Victoria hesitated, and in that silence I could almost picture the exact moment realization started creeping into her expression. "He's nobody," she finally said, though even her own voice sounded uncertain now. "He's my ex-husband. He used to design buildings for a living before the divorce." "Your ex-husband," Richard said, "just outbid me by $100 million in cash without blinking. He bought the auction house that hosted the sale before the gala even started. Do you understand what kind of money that requires? What kind of positioning that takes?" The recording captured a long pause after that, the kind that stretches when someone realizes they've made a mistake far bigger than they initially understood. "I didn't know," Victoria said quietly. "That's exactly the problem," Richard shot back. "You humiliated a man worth more than my entire company in front of the most influential people in this city, and you did it because you assumed he was still the broke architect you left 6 years ago." What followed was less of a conversation and more of a slow unraveling. According to the transcript, Richard paced the study for several minutes while Victoria tried to explain herself, insisting she had no way of knowing that the wine incident was a spur-of-the-moment reaction to old resentment rather than a calculated attack. Richard wasn't interested in her reasoning. He was already running numbers in his head, trying to figure out how to distance himself from the fallout before it reached his other investors. "Every partner I have is going to see that footage by tomorrow morning," he said. "Every single one. And when they do, they're not going to see a private moment between 2 exes. They're going to see the woman I'm engaged to publicly attacking a man who apparently controls enough capital to buy an entire auction house on a whim." Victoria's voice cracked slightly when she responded, the confident tone she'd carried all night finally giving way to something closer to panic. "So what do you want me to do?" she asked. Richard's answer, according to the report, came without hesitation. "Fix it," he said. "Go to him. Use whatever history you two have. Beg if you have to. Because right now, you're not an asset to this relationship. You're a liability. And I didn't build what I have by holding on to liabilities." The recording ended there, cutting off as the two of them moved out of range of the study's audio pickup. But Marcus Webb's written summary noted that Victoria left the estate less than an hour later, her car pulling out of the private gate just before 2 in the morning. Reading through the transcript at my kitchen counter the next day, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, though there was some of that buried underneath everything else. Mostly, what I felt was clarity. Victoria hadn't married Richard because she loved him any more than she had loved me. She had attached herself to whoever represented power at the time, and the moment that power shifted, so would her loyalty. Which meant the ultimatum Richard gave her wasn't really the end of anything. It was the beginning of exactly the kind of pressure I needed her under. By 8 the next morning, the footage was already spreading faster than I had anticipated. I hadn't personally released anything. I didn't need to. 3 different guests at the gala had captured the moment on their phones, and in a room full of influential people desperate for social media relevance, it was only a matter of hours before those clips found their way onto every platform that mattered. What I had done, quietly, through a media relations firm under one of Halcyon's subsidiary companies, was make sure the right outlets received the highest quality version of the footage, along with just enough context to shape how the story would be told. Sitting in my office overlooking the financial district, I watched the numbers climb on 3 different monitors. A gossip account with close to 2 million followers had posted the clearest angle of the wine incident just after 7, captioned simply, "She really thought she was still married to a broke man." By 9, it had over 400,000 views. By 10, local news affiliates were reaching out to my PR team for comment, though we declined every request, letting the silence work in our favor the same way it had at the gala. Daniel walked in around 11 with his tablet already open to a trending topics page. "It's not just the wine anymore," he said. "People pulled up old interviews Victoria did during your divorce." I hadn't thought about those interviews in years, but apparently the internet had a longer memory than I did. Back when our marriage ended, Victoria had given a handful of press interviews about building her firm from the ground up, careful never to mention that most of the foundational work, the actual architectural designs that made the company's early reputation, had come from me. At the time, I was too exhausted from the legal battle to correct the narrative publicly. Now, with the wine footage giving people a reason to dig deeper, those old interviews were resurfacing with a very different context attached. Commenters who had never heard of either of us 6 years ago were suddenly piecing together a story of a woman who had taken credit for her ex-husband's work, then humiliated him in public the moment she assumed he had nothing left to offer, only to discover he had quietly become one of the wealthiest men in the city. It was the kind of narrative people couldn't resist sharing, not because it was particularly unique, but because it felt like justice landing exactly where it belonged. By early afternoon, the story had crossed over from social media gossip into actual business journalism. A financial reporter I had worked with years earlier reached out to my office, asking if I would confirm my identity as the anonymous buyer behind Halcyon Sovereign Holdings. I agreed to a short, carefully worded statement, nothing dramatic, just enough to confirm the acquisition of the waterfront rights and the auction house, framed entirely around the business decision rather than anything personal. That single confirmation changed everything. Once my name was publicly tied to Halcyon, institutional investors who had spent years quietly watching Victoria's firm from a distance suddenly had a new lens through which to view her business practices. If the man she had publicly humiliated turned out to be sitting on this level of capital, the obvious question became, what else about her story didn't add up? By 3 in the afternoon, my legal team forwarded me a report showing the first signs of movement. 2 mid-sized investment groups that had committed funding to Victoria's active downtown development had quietly reached out to their contacts, asking about the stability of her firm's leadership. It wasn't a dramatic withdrawal yet, just a series of cautious questions, the kind investors ask right before they start pulling their money out slowly enough that nobody notices until it's too late to stop. I hadn't asked anyone to make those calls. I didn't need to. Fear moves through financial circles the same way it moves through any other room full of people protecting their own interests. Once the perception shifted that Victoria's judgment couldn't be trusted, that her public behavior reflected poorly on anyone associated with her, the withdrawal became inevitable without me lifting a single additional finger. By early evening, Daniel brought me another update, this one more concrete. A boutique lending firm that had been finalizing a bridge loan for Victoria's flagship tower project had paused the deal entirely, citing what their internal memo called reputational risk exposure requiring further review. That kind of language rarely meant a pause. It usually meant the deal was already dead, and the firm simply hadn't found the right moment to say so directly. I sat with that information for a long moment, watching the sun start to dip behind the skyline outside my window. 6 years ago, Victoria had walked away from our marriage with a company built almost entirely on my early designs, confident that her name alone was enough to keep it running. She had spent those years cultivating an image of effortless success, never once acknowledging what it had cost me to lose everything in that settlement. Now that image was cracking apart in real time, not because I had orchestrated some elaborate revenge scheme against her business directly, but because the truth about who actually held power in this situation had simply become visible for the first time. Later that night, my legal team sent over the due diligence file they had been compiling on her current construction portfolio, the one covering her flagship downtown tower project. I hadn't asked for it specifically that day, but the timing felt significant. As the market turned against her and her financial cushion started disappearing, the pressure to cut corners on that project was only going to increase. I opened the file, scanning through page after page of permits, inspection records, and contractor agreements, and something near the bottom of the third page caught my attention immediately. The page in front of me listed a permit number that didn't match anything in the city's public zoning database. I sat with that for a moment, rereading it twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting the file. My legal team had flagged it with a small red note in the margin, the kind of detail easy to miss if you weren't looking for exactly this type of inconsistency. I called my lead counsel, a sharp woman named Maya Lopez, who had handled every major acquisition Halcyon made over the past 4 years, and asked her to walk me through what she'd found. "It's buried," she said over the phone. "Whoever filed it knew how to make it look legitimate on the surface. But when we cross-reference the permit numbers against the city's actual records, 3 of them don't exist in the municipal system at all." "Meaning what, exactly?" I asked, though I already had a guess forming. "Meaning Victoria's flagship tower, the one she's been using as collateral for at least 2 other loans, was built partially on forged inspection approvals," Maya said. "Structural clearance for the 12th through 15th floors was never actually issued by the city. Someone falsified the documentation to keep construction moving on schedule." I leaned back in my chair, letting that settle. 6 years ago, Victoria used to lecture me about cutting corners, back when we were running the firm together and I would push back on tight deadlines that risked compromising design integrity. She always insisted that quality mattered more than speed, that our reputation depended on doing things the right way, even when it cost us time and money. Apparently, that principle had quietly disappeared the moment I was no longer there to enforce it. "How confident are we in this?" I asked. "Confident enough to bring in an independent structural engineer for verification before we move forward with anything?" Maya said. "If this holds up, and I believe it will, her firm isn't just facing a reputational problem anymore. They're facing potential criminal liability for falsifying municipal safety documents." I thought about that phrase for a long moment. Criminal liability. 6 years ago, when Victoria's lawyers sat across from me in a conference room and calmly explained why the company I built belonged to her, I remember feeling like the entire legal system existed to protect people who understood how to manipulate it. Now here I was, sitting on evidence that could dismantle everything she had built on top of the foundation she took from me, and the temptation to release it immediately was almost overwhelming. But rushing this would be a mistake, and I knew it the moment the thought crossed my mind. If I leaked the falsified permits right now, in the middle of the media storm already surrounding the wine footage, it would look exactly like what it actually was. A calculated attack from an ex-husband with an obvious motive for revenge. Any competent lawyer on her side would spin that narrative instantly, painting me as a bitter man weaponizing old grudges rather than someone genuinely concerned about public safety. The story would shift away from her actions and onto my intentions, and that shift alone could undo everything the last 24 hours had accomplished. I needed this information to surface at a moment when it couldn't be dismissed as personal. Sit on it for now, I told Maya. Get the independent verification done quietly. No public filings, nothing that could trace back to us yet. I want this airtight before it ever sees daylight. Understood, she said. How long are we talking? However long it takes for her to make the next move on her own, I said. She's under financial pressure now. Pressure makes people careless. When she starts scrambling to keep that project moving to reassure her lenders, that's when this becomes undeniable instead of suspicious. After I hung up, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring out at the skyline where Victoria's tower stood among dozens of other buildings, indistinguishable from the outside, hiding a structural flaw that could put actual lives at risk if left unaddressed. That part of this situation was the one piece that had nothing to do with our history. Whatever satisfaction I felt watching her empire crumble under the weight of her own decisions, the falsified permits were a different kind of problem entirely, one that extended beyond the two of us into every person who would eventually live or work inside that building. It was strange, realizing that somewhere underneath 6 years of resentment, I still cared about the kind of work our firm used to represent. The version of Victoria I married had once cried over a delayed inspection because she refused to compromise on tenant safety, insisting we push the timeline back 3 months rather than risk cutting a single corner. I didn't know exactly when that version of her disappeared, whether it happened gradually under the pressure of running a company alone, or all at once, the moment she realized how much faster things moved when nobody was checking her work. Either way, the woman who poured wine on me last night wasn't the person I had built a firm with. She was someone who had learned to survive by taking shortcuts, both in business and in how she treated people who were no longer useful to her. My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel just after 10 that night, a single line along with a screenshot attached. She's requesting a meeting, wants to see you in person as soon as possible. I read the message twice before setting the phone down on my desk, watching the city lights flicker below like 1,000 small warnings nobody was paying attention to yet. I made her wait 4 hours before letting her into my office. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in it. I needed her to sit in that lobby long enough to understand the shift that had happened between us, to feel what it was like waiting on someone else's schedule for once, instead of assuming the world would rearrange itself around her convenience. 6 years ago, I used to wait outside her meetings for hours while she decided when I was worth her time. It felt strange, watching the same dynamic reverse itself so completely. Daniel buzzed my office just after 4 in the afternoon. She's been out there since noon, he said. Hasn't touched her phone once, just been staring at the wall. Send her in, I said. Victoria walked through the door, looking nothing like the woman who had poured wine on me 2 nights earlier. Gone was the shimmering gold gown, replaced with a simple black blazer that seemed almost deliberately understated, like she had chosen it, hoping it would make her look less like the person the entire city was currently talking about. Her makeup was carefully done, but not enough to hide the exhaustion underneath her eyes. She sat down across from my desk without waiting for an invitation, folding her hands in her lap the way she used to when she wanted to seem composed during difficult conversations. I remembered that habit from our marriage. It never actually meant she was calm. It meant she was working hard to appear that way. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch long enough that she shifted slightly in her seat, uncomfortable with the absence of a reaction. "You wanted this meeting," I finally said. "I assume you have something specific to say." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a softness I hadn't heard from her in years. "I know what this looks like. I know I hurt you at that gala, and I know I've probably hurt you for a lot longer than that. But I need you to understand something. What I did that night wasn't really about you. It was about everything I've been carrying since our divorce, the pressure of proving I could build something on my own, the fear that people only ever saw me as the woman who used to be married to someone talented. I saw you standing there and something in me just broke. I studied her for a long moment, trying to determine how much of what she was saying was genuine and how much was calculated performance designed to appeal to whatever sympathy I might still have buried beneath 6 years of resentment. The tears gathering in her eyes looked real enough, but I had learned a long time ago that Victoria's emotions, however authentic they felt to her in the moment, had a way of aligning perfectly with whatever outcome she needed. "You humiliated me in front of 300 people," I said. "And now that I have something you need, you're telling me it was never really about me at all." "That's not what I meant," she said quickly. "Then explain what you meant," I said, "because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a woman who realized her fiancé is about to leave her and her business is collapsing and suddenly remembered she used to be married to someone with resources." Her composure cracked slightly at that, the careful softness in her expression giving way to something closer to desperation. "Richard already left," she said. "The engagement is over. My investors are pulling out one by one. I don't know how much longer my firm survives if this keeps going. I'm not asking for us to go back to anything. I'm asking for help. A loan, an investment, anything that buys me enough time to stabilize things." I reached for the remote control sitting on my desk and turned toward the large monitor mounted on the wall across from her. With a single click, the wine footage began playing. The same clip that had spread across the internet over the past 2 days, her voice ringing out clearly through the office speakers as she called me a ghost at somebody else's party and emptied the glass over my head. Victoria flinched, looking away from the screen. "That's not necessary," she said quietly. "I think it is," I said, letting the clip loop a second time. "Because I want you to understand something clearly before we go any further. The market doesn't care about our history. It doesn't care about 6 years of marriage or how we ended things or whatever complicated feelings you were working through when you poured that glass on me. The market records liabilities, not nostalgia. And right now, every investor watching your firm sees a liability wearing a very expensive dress." "So that's it," she said, her voice tightening. "You're just going to let me lose everything." "I'm not taking anything from you that you didn't already put at risk yourself," I said. "I didn't forge those safety inspections on your tower. I didn't leverage your assets past what your firm could actually sustain. I didn't walk into a room full of powerful people and attack someone in front of cameras because I assumed he had nothing left to lose." She stared at me, and for the first time since she walked into my office, I saw something shift behind her eyes. A slow realization that no amount of tears or careful words was going to change my answer. "I'm not giving you a bailout, Victoria," I said, turning off the monitor and letting the room fall quiet again. "But I am curious how deep this collapse actually goes, and I have a feeling we're both about to find out." 2 days after Victoria left my office, my legal team confirmed what I already suspected would happen. Desperate to reassure her remaining lenders that her flagship tower project remained on schedule, she had pushed her construction crews into overtime, running 2 additional shifts to accelerate completion of the upper floors before her next round of investor calls. It was exactly the kind of panic move I had been waiting for. Maya called me early that morning with an update on the independent structural verification her team had quietly arranged the week before. "The engineer confirmed everything," she said. "Floors 12 through 15 were built on falsified inspection approvals. No legitimate structural clearance was ever issued for that section of the building." "And the accelerated construction schedule?" I asked. "Makes it worse," Maya said. "They're adding load to floors that were never properly certified in the first place. If those crews keep working at this pace, we're not just talking about a paperwork violation anymore. We're talking about a genuine safety risk to everyone working inside that building right now." That single detail changed everything for me. Up until that point, I had been thinking about this situation primarily through the lens of the divorce, the humiliation at the gala, the years of resentment finally finding an outlet. But hearing that construction workers, people who had nothing to do with Victoria's personal decisions or our history together, were currently inside a building with unverified structural integrity, shifted something in my priorities. I want this reported today, I said. Not leaked. Reported through the proper municipal channels, framed entirely around public safety. Maya paused for a moment on the line. That removes any narrative where this looks personal. That's the point, I said. This was never actually about revenge. It's about the fact that people are working inside a building that could genuinely be dangerous because someone cut corners to protect their bottom line. By that afternoon, my team had formally submitted the independent engineering report to the city's Department of Buildings, along with the falsified permit documentation Maya's investigators had uncovered weeks earlier. As a majority stakeholder in several adjacent commercial properties within that district, following my acquisition of the waterfront rights, I had standing to formally request an emergency municipal inspection, a right I exercised without hesitation. The response from the city was faster than I expected. By early evening, I had a direct line into the situation through Marcus Webb's security team, positioned near the site to monitor developments. Daniel sent updates every 20 minutes as the situation unfolded, each message carrying more weight than the last. Inspectors just arrived, the first message read. 6 vehicles, full team. 15 minutes later, another update. Work has been halted on all floors above 11. Crews are being sent home. I sat at my desk that evening, watching the live local news coverage that had picked up the story within hours. Drone footage circling Victoria's downtown tower as city inspectors moved through each level, confirming violation after violation that matched exactly what my legal team had already uncovered. The reporter covering the segment spoke with the kind of urgency reserved for genuine public safety concerns, explaining that preliminary findings suggested falsified inspection records dating back over a year. Watching that footage, I felt none of the satisfaction I expected. Instead, I found myself thinking about the workers who had been pulled off that site, many of them likely worried about lost wages from the sudden stoppage, none of them responsible for the decisions that put them in that position in the first place. Victoria's shortcuts hadn't just risked her own financial future, they had put ordinary people at risk without ever asking their permission. My phone rang around 8 that night. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring twice before answering. "You did this," she said the moment I picked up, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and panic. "You reported my project to the city." "I reported falsified safety documents that put people's lives at risk," I said calmly. "That's not the same thing as targeting you personally, even if you're having trouble seeing the difference right now." "My entire project is shut down," she said. "Every lender I have is calling, asking questions I can't answer. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost me?" "I have a very good idea," I said. "I used to run cost projections for exactly this kind of project, if you remember. The difference is, I never would have let it get built on forged documentation in the first place." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, broken only by what sounded like her breathing, unsteady and shallow. "You could have warned me privately," she finally said, "given me a chance to fix it before it became public." "You had 6 years to run your company with integrity," I said. "I'm not responsible for the choices you made during that time, and I'm certainly not obligated to protect you from the consequences of them now." She didn't respond to that. Instead, I heard the call disconnect, the silence on my end feeling almost louder than the conversation had been. I set my phone down and looked back at the news coverage still playing on the monitor across my office, watching as reporters interviewed a structural engineer, explaining the specific risks associated with unverified load-bearing capacity on high-rise construction. It struck me then that this entire situation had grown far beyond anything I originally set out to accomplish. What started as a calculated business move to reclaim power Victoria had taken from me during our divorce had evolved into something with real consequences for people who had never been part of our history at all. Daniel walked into my office just as the segment ended, holding his tablet with a fresh update from Marcus Webb's team. "There's something else you should probably see," he said, turning the screen toward me. "Word's already spreading through the banking community. Victoria's firm just got flagged by 3 separate credit committees this afternoon." The tablet Daniel handed me showed a summary from 3 separate credit committees, each one flagging Victoria's firm within hours of each other. That kind of coordinated caution rarely happened by accident in the finance world, but I understood exactly what was driving it. Once the municipal audit hit the news, every lender with exposure to her projects had a fiduciary obligation to reassess the risk they were carrying, and nobody wanted to be the last institution standing when her company finally collapsed. "There's one more thing," Daniel said, scrolling further down the screen. "She's requested a meeting with the Beacon Circle for tomorrow morning." I sat back in my chair, genuinely surprised for the first time in days. The Beacon Circle wasn't a name most people outside of serious financial circles would recognize, but within the city's black business community, it carried significant weight. It was a private banking union formed nearly 2 decades earlier by a coalition of successful black entrepreneurs and investors, designed to provide capital access and emergency lending to businesses that traditional banks routinely underserved or overlooked. Membership wasn't public, and the lending decisions made within that room stayed within that room. Victoria had known about the Beacon Circle for years, mostly through her personal connections within the community rather than any direct involvement of her own. I remembered her mentioning it once during our marriage, describing it almost reverently as the kind of institution she hoped to eventually earn a seat at, back when she still believed our combined success might open that door for both of us. "She's assuming her relationships will get her an emergency bridge loan," I said, more to myself than to Daniel. "Will they?" he asked. I thought about that question for a long moment before answering. "She doesn't know I've been a primary shareholder in the Circle's lending fund for the past 3 years. Daniel's expression shifted slightly. "She has no idea you're involved." "None," I said. "I kept my involvement quiet, specifically because I didn't want my presence influencing lending decisions that were meant to help genuine businesses in the community. This is the first time it's ever mattered." The Beacon Circle met inside a private lounge on the top floor of one of the city's oldest financial buildings, a space intentionally kept away from the noise and visibility of mainstream banking institutions. I had attended maybe a handful of meetings over the years, usually staying quiet in the background while the board reviewed applications and made decisions collectively. Tomorrow would be different. I arrived early the next morning, taking my usual seat at the head of the long mahogany table where the board convened. The other members trickled in over the following 20 minutes. Familiar faces from years of quiet involvement, each of them greeting me with the kind of respect built from consistent presence rather than flashy gestures. Victoria arrived at exactly 9, dressed in a tailored grey suit that looked expensive but restrained, clearly chosen to project stability rather than the glamour she usually favored. She walked in with a folder of financial documents under her arm, prepared to make her case, and stopped completely still the moment she saw me seated at the head of the table. "What is he doing here?" she said, directing the question to the board chair, a woman named Elaine Duval, who had led the Circle since its founding. "Mr. Bishop is our primary shareholder," Elaine said calmly. "He's been an active member of this board for the past 3 years. Victoria's eyes moved back to me, searching my face for some kind of explanation, some sign that this was a coincidence rather than something deliberate. I gave her nothing, keeping my expression neutral, the same way she used to keep hers neutral during business meetings when she wanted to appear unaffected by pressure. "You knew I was coming here," she said quietly. "I've known you'd end up here for the past 2 days," I said. "Your options have been narrowing since the audit went public. This was always the logical next step." Elaine gestured for Victoria to take a seat, and after a moment of visible hesitation, she did, opening her folder and beginning her pitch. She spoke about her firm's history within the community, the jobs her projects had created, the years she had spent building relationships with local contractors and vendors who depended on her business staying afloat. It was a well-constructed presentation, emotionally resonant in a way that likely would have worked under different circumstances. But the moment she finished, Elaine turned to me directly. "Mr. Bishop, given your position on this board, we'd like your assessment before we proceed to a vote." Every eye in the room shifted toward me. Victoria's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table, her composure holding just barely as she waited to hear what I would say. "I think everyone in this room already knows the situation," I said. Her flagship project was shut down 2 days ago due to falsified safety inspections. Her fiancé ended their engagement following public scrutiny of her business practices. 3 separate credit committees have flagged her firm within the past 24 hours alone. This isn't a business that needs a temporary bridge loan to weather a rough quarter. This is a business in active structural and financial collapse. "That's not fair," Victoria said, her voice sharp with desperation. "You're speaking from personal bias." "I'm speaking from the exact due diligence any responsible lender would run before extending emergency capital," I said. "If anything, my personal history with you means I understand the full scope of this situation better than anyone else at this table." Elaine looked around at the other board members, several of whom were already nodding slightly, their expressions confirming what I suspected they had already concluded on their own before I even spoke. "All in favor of declining the loan request?" Elaine said. The vote was unanimous. Victoria sat frozen as the decision was formally recorded, her folder of carefully prepared documents suddenly meaningless in her lap. I watched her realize, in real time, that the one lifeline she believed was untouchable, the community connections she had spent years cultivating, had just closed its doors to her completely. "This was my last option," she said quietly, almost to herself. Elaine offered a brief, professional response about the board's commitment to responsible lending, but Victoria wasn't really listening anymore. Her eyes had drifted toward me, and for the first time since the wine hit my face at that gala, I saw something in her expression that looked less like anger and more like the beginning of genuine fear about what came next. Word of the Beacon Circle's decision reached Richard before I even left the building. I found out later that one of the junior associates in his firm had a cousin who worked as an assistant to one of the board members, and within an hour of the vote, the news had traveled through exactly the kind of informal channels that move faster than any official announcement ever could. By the time I got back to my office that afternoon, Daniel already had an update waiting for me. "Richard's lawyer contacted your legal team this morning," he said, before the vote even happened. That surprised me slightly. "About what?" "Asset protection," Daniel said. "He's been quietly working with his attorneys since the night of the auction to separate his personal holdings from anything connected to Victoria. Sounds like he accelerated the timeline once he heard about the Beacon Circle meeting." I sat with that information for a moment, thinking about the conversation Richard and Victoria had inside his study the night of the gala, the one Marcus Webb's team had recorded. Even then, Richard's instincts had been clear. He wasn't a man who stayed loyal out of sentiment. He was someone who calculated risk constantly, adjusting his position the moment any relationship, personal or professional, threatened to cost him more than it benefited him. By the following morning, the story had made its way into local business news, this time framed less around the wine incident and more around the unraveling of Victoria's engagement. A financial columnist I occasionally spoke with reached out, asking if I wanted to comment on reports that Richard's firm was formally distancing itself from her, both personally and professionally. I declined the request, the same way I had declined every previous opportunity to insert myself publicly into the narrative. The story was moving forward without any help from me at this point. Many called later that afternoon with details from the actual filing. "Richard signed an asset shielding agreement 2 days ago," she said. "It's fairly aggressive, separates every joint account they'd started merging, revokes her access to 2 properties registered under his holding company, and includes language specifically designed to protect his firm from any liability associated with her ongoing investor lawsuits." "Lawsuits?" I repeated. 3 filed so far, Maya said, all from investors in her tower project, claiming financial damages related to the shutdown. More are likely coming once word spreads that her insurance carrier is disputing coverage due to the falsified permits. I leaned back in my chair, processing the scope of what was unfolding. 6 years ago, I had been the one facing lawsuits and financial ruin, sitting alone in a rented apartment trying to figure out how to rebuild from nothing, while Victoria walked away with everything intact. Now the situation had reversed so completely that even the people closest to her were rushing to protect themselves from the fallout of her decisions. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Elaine Duval, the Beacon Circle's board chair. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "Victoria requested a private meeting with me after yesterday's vote. Off the record, not through official channels." "What did she want?" I asked. "To understand your involvement," Elaine said. "She kept asking how long you'd been part of the board, whether the other members knew about your history with her before the vote happened. I told her the truth. Nobody knew until you spoke up in that meeting. Your involvement in the circle has always been kept quiet, exactly as you requested when you joined." "How did she take that?" I asked.
Elaine paused before answering. Honestly, she seemed less angry than I expected, mostly just tired. She said something I found interesting before she left. She said she used to think you were the one who needed protecting in that marriage, and now she's starting to understand she had that completely backwards the entire time. I didn't respond right away, letting that comment settle somewhere I wasn't entirely prepared for. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. After the call ended, I found myself thinking about the early years of our marriage, before the resentment and the divorce and everything that followed. There had been a version of Victoria who used to stay up late with me, sketching building concepts on napkins, genuinely excited about the work, rather than focused on how it would look to outsiders. I didn't know exactly when that version of her disappeared, whether the pressure of running a business alone had changed her, or whether that ambition had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to fully surface. Either way, the woman navigating 3 investor lawsuits and a broken engagement wasn't someone I recognized from those early years anymore. 2 days later, Daniel confirmed that Richard had officially ended the engagement through a brief public statement released by his publicist, citing personal and professional differences without elaborating further. Victoria didn't respond publicly. She hadn't posted anything on any of her social accounts since the wine footage first went viral, her usual online presence replaced by complete silence. Marcus Webb's team continued monitoring the situation from a distance, mostly to ensure nothing escalated into anything requiring intervention, and their reports over the following week painted a picture of someone systematically losing every piece of the life she had built after our divorce. Her office lease wasn't renewed. 2 senior employees resigned within days of each other, both citing concerns about the company's financial stability in their departure statements. The insurance dispute over her tower project dragged into its 2nd week without resolution, freezing any possibility of resuming construction, even if she somehow found a way to address the falsified permits. Sitting in my office one evening, reviewing the latest updates from Maya's team, I realized the situation had reached a point where my direct involvement was becoming almost unnecessary. The consequences of Victoria's own decisions, the shortcuts she had taken to maintain an image of effortless success, were now unfolding entirely on their own momentum, gathering weight with each passing day, like something that had been building toward this moment long before I ever stepped into that ballroom. Daniel knocked on my office door just as I was closing the file for the night. "There's a groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the waterfront project next week," he said. "Your team wants to know if you'll be attending in person." I thought about that for a moment, picturing the 12 acres of coastline that had started this entire chain of events, transforming from an auction house bidding war into something that had reshaped far more than either of us originally anticipated. "Confirm my attendance," I said. 2 weeks had passed since the wine hit my face at that gala, and standing at the edge of the waterfront site on a clear morning, watching sunlight spread across 12 acres of coastline that used to belong to no one and now belonged entirely to me, it felt like an entirely different lifetime had unfolded in that short window of time. The groundbreaking ceremony had drawn a larger crowd than I expected. City officials, international architects, local contractors who would be working on the project for the next several years, all gathered near a small stage set up close to the water's edge. A golden shovel rested against a podium, waiting for the formal moment the cameras were positioned to capture. I stood off to the side for a while, letting the event organizers finish their preparations, watching the crowd mingle the same way they had at the gala 2 weeks earlier. Except this time, the energy in the air felt different, less performative. More genuine anticipation for what this land was actually going to become.
Daniel found me near the edge of the crowd, holding his tablet with a fresh notification on the screen. "You should see this before you go up there," he said, turning it toward me. The headline was simple and direct. Victoria's real estate firm had officially filed for full liquidation that morning, closing out what remained of her assets to settle the growing list of investor lawsuits and outstanding debts tied to the tower project. The insurance dispute had finally resolved, not in her favor, confirming that the falsified permits voided her coverage entirely and left her personally exposed to a significant portion of the financial damages. I read through the article slowly, feeling less triumphant than I expected. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose everything, even someone who had spent years taking credit for work that wasn't hers and had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people without a second thought. What I felt instead was something closer to closure, the sense that 6 years of quiet effort had finally reached a natural conclusion, rather than the specific victory I had once imagined during those early months after our divorce. "Her licenses are being revoked too," Daniel added. "State board suspended her ability to operate in real estate development, pending a full review of the falsified inspection records." I handed the tablet back to him without responding right away, turning my attention toward the water instead. Somewhere beyond the construction fencing, gulls circled low over the waves, indifferent to everything that had unfolded over the past 2 weeks. The auctions and the audits and the collapsed engagement and the slow public unraveling of a woman who had once been my entire world. The ceremony organizer approached a few minutes later, letting me know it was time to begin. I walked toward the small stage, past rows of folding chairs filled with people who had no real connection to my history with Victoria. People who simply saw an opportunity in the new development rising out of this land and wanted to be part of its beginning. A city official gave a short speech about revitalization and economic growth, gesturing toward architectural renderings displayed on large boards near the stage, showing what the waterfront district would look like within the next several years. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my remarks brief, focused entirely on the project itself rather than anything personal. I talked about the importance of building something that would genuinely serve the community rather than simply maximizing profit, about the commitment to using local contractors and ensuring every phase of construction met safety standards that went beyond the minimum legal requirements. I meant every word of it, more than the crowd probably realized. After everything I had learned about Victoria's flagship tower, the corners cut in the name of speed and appearance, I understood exactly what kind of builder I refused to become. After the speech, I walked toward the podium and picked up the golden shovel, the metal cool against my palms despite the warm morning sun. As I pushed it into the soft earth marking the official start of construction, I felt my phone buzz once in my jacket pocket. I didn't check it immediately, letting the moment settle first. The applause from the crowd rising around me as photographers captured the image that would likely appear in tomorrow's business coverage. This wasn't the version of success I had imagined during those early months after the divorce, sitting alone in that rented apartment with $11 in my account. Back then, success had meant proving Victoria wrong, showing her exactly what she had thrown away. Standing here now, surrounded by people excited about what this project could genuinely become for the city, success felt like something quieter and more permanent than that. Once the ceremony wrapped up and the crowd began dispersing, I finally checked my phone. It was a message from Maya, confirming the final details of Victoria's liquidation filing, along with a note mentioning that she had been spotted outside the security perimeter earlier that morning, watching the ceremony from a distance before quietly leaving before it concluded. I hadn't seen her there myself, but something about that image stayed with me as I walked back toward my car. Victoria, standing outside a fence, watching a skyline rise under a name that used to belong to both of us, now belonging entirely to someone she had once dismissed as a nobody clinging to her success. 6 years ago, she walked away from our marriage believing she had taken everything of value and left me with nothing. She never understood that the years of silence following that divorce weren't emptiness. They were construction, quiet and patient, built entirely outside her line of sight until the moment it was ready to be seen. Daniel pulled the car around, and as I settled into the back seat, I looked out at the waterfront site one final time, watching workers begin the early stages of groundwork beneath a clear blue sky. Whatever came next for Victoria, wherever she rebuilt from here, if she chose to rebuild at all, that story no longer belonged to me. Mine had already moved forward, rising steadily from the ground up, exactly the way I had spent 6 years quietly making sure it would.